Welcome to the Bonhoeffer Show with Bill Hull. The show about stuff most people try to avoid, but can't because it controls their lives. Religion, culture, and politics. Why does Bill Hull host this show? Because he and Bonhoeffer hoisted a few brews together in Berlin. Nope. That never happened. Is it that Bonhoeffer's book, The Cost of Discipleship, both challenged and changed Bill as a young man? Well, yes, that is part of it. But it's primarily because Bonhoeffer called us to a costly discipleship. And there has never been a time when such courage has been more absent or desperately needed than now. Bonhoeffer famously said, "Christianity without discipleship is always Christianity without Christ." The Bonhoeffer Project is committed to turning leaders into disciple makers. Because if leaders fail to create disciple-making movements, then we have failed. So, ladies and gentlemen, here he is. He's still tall and good-looking. And yes, he is wearing German cologne. He's acquired a few more underlying conditions. But direct from his underground bunker in Long Beach, California, the man who once told Don Henley, "You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave," Bill Hull.
It's an amazing thing that all these years later, here we are again. And no reports. Well, first of all, I just want to thank Hollis and his daughter Holly and their team for putting this all together so that we could be together to put ourselves in the line of fire where God can speak to us. That's really a lot about it. And I mean, the growing into Christ is about getting ourselves into position, into His line of fire, to where He can reach us, where He can speak to us. Now, I first came to Pittsburgh to see Hollis. And he was very young, and I was sort of young. And I remember, one of the things I remember most of it was being in the hotel of the Pittsburgh Steelers the night before their game, and walking down the hallway, and Chuck Noll came out of a room and he looked at me. And he gave me that Chuck Noll stare that everybody kind of knows what it is. And I stopped, and he looked over at me, then he looked at Hollis, and he went, and he shrugged it off and left, because he saw Hollis, that this guy's okay, because I don't know who this guy is. And then we had our great breakfast with Terry Bradshaw. And I've been telling this story for a number of years, a lot of years actually, ever since that day actually, that I had coffee with Terry Bradshaw and this other guy. And it was the day he started his very first game for the Steelers. Well, that was sort of true. It was 1974, and so when Hollis and I started reminiscing, he couldn't remember it. He had no memory of that event. And then I said, "Don't you remember, Hollis, when we went on that weekend retreat with the Steelers, and don't you remember that we used to hang out with the steel curtain and all those kind?" He says, "No, I don't remember that either." And I began to wonder, well, maybe it never happened. But a fond memory. All right, so what are we going to do tonight and tomorrow morning? Well, what we're going to be doing is we're really going to start off with one of the worst drawings you'll ever see, which is I'm going to make it right now. And I just want to kind of explain a little bit of something that I've been thinking about recently. So we're going to go over here to the board. And this is this will be in the Smithsonian, I'm sure, in one of the museums eventually. But a pastor recently was telling me about how he was struggling as a pastor with disciple making. And so as he was talking, I drew what he was telling me. he said that essentially, this is him, by the way, just so you've never met him, he's right here. And he said that he worked with other people as individuals, one at a time, like one-on-one disciple making. And he said the problem with all that was he spent all this time in the Word, drinking lots of coffee, memorizing Scripture, doing lots of really good things about getting closer to Jesus. And what happened? He said they didn't reproduce. And what we know fundamentally is disciples reproduce. So then he decided, well, maybe he went to a conference or two, and he says, what I need to do is get these guys in groups. So he got a bunch of people in groups. And he said the problem he had after spending a lot of time with these people in the groups is they didn't multiply either. And then he said, I don't really have a strategy for my church. So this is a church, by the way. I told you this wasn't very good. So there's a church down here at the bottom. That little building represents a church. And he said the thing was that neither was his church. So his frustration was he wasn't seeing reproduction here, he wasn't seeing reproduction with groups, and he wasn't seeing reproduction in the church. And we were talking about, why not? So I have one more drawing, and then that may be all the drawings for a while. All right? Now, Hollis and I actually got part of this from Hollis, and he says he sort of got it from me, so I don't know what's going on with that. But anyway, it's to me, the issues about disciple making, almost all discussions about disciple making start with what, and then they go to how. What and how. About 95%, maybe higher, of conversations among leaders deal with what and how. And here's the reason that my friend was having these problems, I think, was that he had missed something. And hey, I missed it for a long, long time. I didn't really come into any kind of different opinion until I was 50. And at that time, I'd already written quite a few books on the subject. So, as you know, that's a problem. But essentially, it's like a river. And so you have upstream. And those of you in the back, I'll just try to keep this simple, and you have to take it by faith that that's what I just wrote up here. But upstream, and then midstream, and then downstream. And what I'm suggesting is that most conversations about disciple making really is about midstream and downstream. And I'm saying that the issue is really upstream. And here's how I know. Because I've been downstream doing this. Now down here is, I'm going to try to make him a little bigger, but here's our pastor again. And the difference is now the pastor has a bucket. I don't know how to draw a bucket. My wife is actually an artist. And she hasn't discipled me very well about that. So here's the bucket, here's the pastor and his bucket. So essentially what's going on is that the pastor, he goes to a conference and he fills up his bucket with pure water. Whatever made that church work, whatever made that church successful, whatever successful means, that he filled up his bucket with that water. He took it back to his church and he started dumping this good water into the downstream here. That means programs, that means trying to improve worship times and worship experiences, trying to do all kinds of things like that, trying to develop small groups that people will join and they can stay in, all the kinds of things that we do downstream. So he keeps, and also there's another thing he's doing with his bucket when he has time. So he's trying to pour the new water in, the good water, the pure water, that'll cure his problem, because there's something wrong with the water. Because whatever's in the water, he can't get individuals to reproduce, he can't get groups to reproduce, and he can't get his own church to reproduce. Therefore, he's got a problem down here in the water. Something wrong with that water. It's poisoned. And so then the other thing he does is he takes his bucket when he's not got any new stuff, and he goes over and tries to bail out the bad water. So he's bailing, and he's bailing, and he's bailing, and he's pouring, and he's pouring, and he's pouring, and all the time his problem is theological. It's upstream. It's a theological problem. Because the gospel that we basically preach now in America, the gospel Americana, which we'll go into some detail in the second session this evening, it does not provide any serious room. Our doctrine of salvation does not provide any serious room for discipleship as a natural part of what it means to be saved. And so I would simply say that all who are called to salvation are called to discipleship. No exceptions. No excuses. All right, so the issue is upstream. So when people say, well, I remember, being in Campus Crusade and Crew, when we started talking about what the gospel was, everybody just took for granted we knew what the gospel was. It's in this 13-page book that we're carrying around in our pockets. It's what Billy Graham says at the end of a church service on television. It's what the Navigators, the bridge. It's 5 steps to peace with God. And that's a good history lesson, by the way. But at this stage, let's just stop here and move into the big why.
We turn leaders into disciple makers. That's the mission of the Bonhoeffer Project. But before we can turn you into a disciple-making leader, we need you to be in a cohort. A cohort is a 1-year, 10-meeting, book-reading, praying, wrestling, writing, planning challenge that has the potential to change you and thus redirect your life. Interested? Here's the process. Go to our website, thebonhoefferproject.com, and complete the application form. We will contact you. We will then help you select the type of cohort that's best for you. In person, online, or online school, which is asynchronous, so it's not affected by time zones and anyone in the world can access it. Oh, and training is now also available in Spanish. In the meantime, subscribe to the show, read one of Bill's books, and send us a question you want Bill or some member of the Bonhoeffer team to answer. And now, back to the show.
See, we've talked about what, we've talked about how a bit. We'll get back to it. But right now I'd like to talk about why. And the why, the center of operations for all of us is Matthew 28. And I'll just read that to you. This is, I'm sure that I could just simply say Matthew 28 and everybody knows what I'm talking about, but if you believe the surveys, 51% of people who are in our churches have never heard of the Great Commission. So Jesus came and told his disciples, I have been given all authority in heaven and on earth. And of course, that's all the authority we're ever going to need. Therefore, go and make disciples. We've been schooled thoroughly in the fact that the command is to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you, and be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Now, there's an awful lot I could say at this point, but this particular passage is present in many churches, and more so now than ever. In the last 7, 8, 9 years, disciple making has moved center stage, and the spotlight is on it. And it's a great opportunity for the church. But there are some problems we have to solve, but the why is really, really important. Back in 1967, when I became a Christian, I was playing basketball at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the chaplain there gave me a book, and it was called The Master Plan of Evangelism by Robert Coleman, who is now 93 years old. It's about 110 pages long. It's a real gem. And he gave me that book, and the reason I wanted to read it was because I wanted to be like Bob. I wanted to be like somebody I would admire, and that's really important in an area of influence. Is I wanted to be like people I admire, and he was one of them, and he gave me that book, so I wanted to read that book. And when I read the book, The Master Plan of Evangelism, it means that making disciples is not just about getting closer to Christ. It's not about just becoming more mature. It's not about any of those kinds of things directly. It actually is God's master plan for evangelizing the world. That's what it is. And so the connection is between Matthew 28 and Matthew 24:14. And when the gospel of the kingdom is preached to every nation, then the end will come. So I want to go back and say, I want to go back and go through this passage and look at it from a different angle. And that is this. He says, go and make disciples of all nations. Now, a disciple, what is a disciple? Well, I think a disciple is a person who has made a decision to follow Jesus and to be a part of what Jesus is doing in the world. In late 80s, I had written a book called The Disciple Making Pastor, and I was invited to be pastor in residence at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School for a week, and so I went there, and on Wednesday they had a faculty meeting, and that was an all-star academic faculty in those days. And they were in this theater kind of setting, and I was down, sort of in the dock, and they were questioning me about my book. And so somebody, in those days, that was the day when John MacArthur had written that book, The Gospel According to Jesus, I believe, and it was quite controversial, for those of you who might remember it. And so they said, Bill, are disciples born or made? And I have to tell you that my mind went blank. I sort of panicked. I began to feel the sweat beating up on me. And then I remembered those words from, was it Luke 12, about if you're ever taken before the Sanhedrin. Well, I really felt like I was before the Sanhedrin at that moment, and that my future as a pastor was in trouble or threatened. And then, as it says in that passage, the Holy Spirit gives you the words, and it came to me. Disciples, I said, they're born to be made. And I think I got it right. I still believe that. It's held up. So a person who, following Jesus, if you're following Jesus, then of course you are his disciple. And so they say, go make disciples, but if you don't follow Jesus somewhere, because he's going somewhere, and one of the reasons my friend was having trouble with reproduction was he would say, let's all become followers of Jesus, and he could say, follow me as I follow Christ, as Paul did, but he really wasn't going anywhere except to church. The only place he was going was to meetings. The only place he was going is to do things that were internal and administration in the church, and that would meet the needs of the congregation, which is not unimportant, but that he wasn't really taking them anywhere that was exciting, that was going to threaten them in any kind of special way. And so for that reason, he was sort of without portfolio. And so this passage goes on. Of all nations. So essentially, if you were to ask this of your leadership in your church, and you sit down and you say, are we making any new disciples? And we're not talking about, now I'm not going to talk here so much about children, because children are the most precious things to us, and we have a responsibility to them, and of course we will be reaching our children. But other than that, are we seeing new disciples? And if the answer is no, then why not? Because what's going to be required here is not only are you going to make new disciples, but you're going to have to make many new disciples. And the reason you have to make many new disciples is because you have to make them in every nation, every ethnic group, every cross-cultural situation. So you not only have to make many disciples, you have to make many more disciples, many more new disciples. And then you have to make many more new disciples who are mature. And then to make many more new disciples who are mature and who are multiplying, reproducing and then multiplying. The difference between reproduction and multiplication is math. So that's essentially the way you can reverse engineer anything you're doing with any group you're with, is simply put it to the test that Matthew 28 gives you. And then if it's not happening, then we have to ask ourselves, why not? And you go all the way back to the basic rudiments. As I told one young man when he came to a conference with several people, he said, well, I brought 7 people on my staff to this meeting, and now I need to tell them something, and when I go home, what should I tell them to do? And I thought about it in the sense that I stood there for almost a minute without answering the question. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to tell him. I'm thinking to myself, here it is.
If you want to expand the disciple-making movement, then share the show with your friends and colleagues. Hey, it's easy to subscribe. Simply go to iTunes or to our website, thebonhoefferproject.com, then click on The Bonhoeffer Show. Once you do, we will keep you updated with the Bonhoeffer Project's events, new materials and books, as well as the larger disciple-making movement current news. You can also access previous programs. And be sure to read Bill's weekly column, which is posted on the website. Remember, ask questions. Bill's answers are guaranteed to give you herd immunity, increase your IQ, and cause you to experience waves of euphoria. Well, not really, but his answers are really good. And now, let's get back to the Bonhoeffer Show.
Nothing. Do nothing. Except, why don't you guys all go home and spend a year deciding whether you are really serious about this? Are you disciples? Are you reproducing? Are you going to lead them anywhere? Is that going to be real to you? Because you shouldn't even begin if you don't have a life to invite them into. A life that you could lead them somewhere. A life that they admire you and what your life is like. All right. So this is essentially the why. The why is because, you know, when Jesus said, make disciples, the interesting thing is, and I I remember a clergy conference I was speaking at a few years ago, and it was one of those monastic kind of retreats where everybody was wearing a cassock, I believe, and we were all there, very serious, times of silence and so on, and so the very highly educated group of men and women, and when I said, make disciples, a few hands went up. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by make disciples? And it's always been important to me to understand that when Jesus said, make disciples to these men, there's no record of them raising their hand and saying, what do you mean by that? Because they knew exactly what he meant. What you've been doing with me, now do with others. And to be able to understand that making disciples and the Great Commission is not about getting closer to Jesus. It's not about going deeper. It's not about any of these things that our psychologized culture, the therapeutic culture in which we live, really tells us that it should be about. And that people are so concerned they might leave somebody behind, or that somebody will be hurt, or their feelings, or they won't be able to express themselves freely. And all these kinds of things that we are concerned about. I'm not saying that there aren't some valid reasons for those things. But here is what I'm also saying that it's not about that. It's about a rescue mission to the world. That's what it's about. That's the why. That's why you tell people, this is worth dying for. Jesus, it was worth his death. It was worth all the things that he did. It's worth our lives. All right, so that's why it's important. Now, there's a problem. And the problem should come up on the screen. Excuse me for peeking. Yes, there it is. And what is the problem? Next slide. Yes. Okay. Essentially, what's happened is that we've taken salvation, this grand concept from Scripture, and we've divided it between conversion and discipleship. And that's the reason that I wrote the book, Conversion and Discipleship. That's the reason that it's the primary text for the Bonhoeffer Project, because it deals with this issue fundamentally at its heart. And that is that if we separate conversion from discipleship, what happens is you make discipleship optional. And so when you make discipleship optional, what do? Like our friend down at the end, down with his bucket, you spend your life trying to get people to take up the option on their contract. You know, when you say conversion is a decision you make, and that discipleship is a second decision you make, then you've divided it. Because the gospel you believe in determines the disciple you make. And the goal is to have it so that discipleship becomes a natural part of what it means to be saved. That when God saved you, he also called you. It's not two things, it's one thing. Salvation and discipleship as separate things is the problem. It's eating the heart out of the church. It destroys initiative. It makes people say, well, you know what? We teach that a person believes the right things and says the prayer or goes through whatever subcultural ritual we have in our group. And when they get that done, then they are Christian. Problem solved. You're good to go. And then we can talk about how serious you're going to be. So we make it possible for people to have various kinds of gospels, various kinds of theology, various kinds of ideas about what it means to be a Christian and what it means in the church as far as my responsibility and the authority of that church, all those kinds of things. But essentially what destroys the initiative and sidelines so many people, well over half of congregations usually, is this idea that salvation is separate from discipleship. Discipleship is optional. It's something that I can do when I have time, or if I have time. And I don't believe that any of the followers of Jesus at the time in which he issued this great, what we call the Great Commission, not one of them believed such a thing. And so this is at the heart of what we call the Gospel Americana. So, I'll end this session with a story. One of my friends I was privileged to know for quite a few years was Dallas Willard, and he was a philosopher at the University of Southern California, but many of you would probably be familiar with some of his books and his works and his understanding of this issue, actually. And so when Dallas and I were having a discussion one day, and essentially it was about, he said there's no such thing as a theology of discipleship. And I said, what are you talking about? I wrote this book, Jesus Christ, Disciple Maker, the Disciple Making Pastor, the Disciple Making Church. How about that? And Dallas was he's a very kind man. And he just laid his big hand on mine and he says, well, Bill, I haven't read all your work, but I don't see it there. And so he said that the key to bringing about any kind of meaningful renewal or surge or fulfillment of the Great Commission was going to be centered around this issue. And that the number one mission field in the world was the Western Hemisphere around this issue of the distortion and the weakening and the watering down and the misunderstanding of things simply as grace. I remember him saying that we have deified grace, that he said we've not only been saved by grace, we've been paralyzed by it. To be passive. There's nothing we can do. All that kind of thing. And so, here are the three things that we can do. One, we can restore our understanding of salvation. In other words, one of the things we do in the Bonhoeffer Project is the first 3 months, we're talking to you about this whole issue. We're not telling you what to believe. We're not telling you even how to communicate it to your congregation or to your group or to the ministry you're in or to your neighbor. But what we are saying is think about it, pray about it, read, struggle. And then the second thing is to rebuild your gospel. In other words, if you were going to take care of this issue, how would you do it? Well, you'd have to start off by redefining what the word faith is, and grace, and forgiveness, and all the key salvation vocabulary. And then we'd have to redo the means and ways in which we do church as a reflection of that. So there's three things there. Restore our understanding of salvation, rebuild the gospel from the ground up, and redo means and ways. I don't mean to imply, nor have I found it to be the case, that where most of the people we meet and talk with have some twisted, unusual, problematic understanding of the gospel in the sense that it's not a gospel that can save people or a gospel that God uses. I'm not saying that. What I am saying, however, is when we talk about the robustness and the fullness and the completeness of what salvation really means and how discipleship needs to be a natural part of what it means to be saved. In other words, we don't really question it. We don't really think of it as an option. We think of it as a calling. We think of it as our entire life. Now, of course that we've had good role models that have taught one thing and lived a different way. What I mean by that is they've taught maybe a forgiveness-only gospel, but yet at the same time, they've lived a life of such dedication, it never occurred to you to get hung up on it. I mean, Bill Bright's a person I would recommend. I remember he was that way. You never were around Bill Bright, the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, without understanding the power of the man and what was happening in his life and how God was blessing him, and it was multiplying people all over the world. Now, regardless of his theology of this particular kind, so I don't want to give you the wrong impression, but I do want to give you this impression that it's a problem and that it needs to be solved.
Well, we hope that the show wasn't too bad. Jane Hull wants everyone to know that if anything Bill said was offensive, she feels your pain. If you were upset by anything Bill and his guests said, well, mission accomplished. At the Bonhoeffer Show, we value irreverent, satirical, and generally inappropriate behavior. But when it comes to fulfilling the Great Commission, we don't mess around. Remember, subscribe. We promise. No private jets, no white suits, and definitely no toupees.